Norfolk has had its share of disasters and tragedies in the past, but I find it interesting that compared to other places, very few people seem to be aware of most of them. Since I posted them, I have received several comments from locals on my videos of the Great Yarmouth Suspension Bridge collapse and the Thorpe Railway disaster, saying they had no idea they had ever happened. And I feel this topic will be much of the same. And I will be completely honest with you. I only found out about it last week while on holiday. Before the coming of the railways in 1844, there was only two ways to travel from the city of Norwich to the fast-growing port town of Great Yarmouth. One was on foot or by horse and cart. That was certainly not a mode of transport for any traveller in a hurry, with even the Acle Strait that makes the journey far easier not being built until the 1830s. Along with this, there was the risk of highwaymen and other unsavoury characters. And the other was by boat, along the rivers and through the Broads, which would be the main way of travelling there if you wished to reach it the same day, as well as the main way of transporting commerce and post between the two locations. The journey had originally started out with sailing vessels or pulled by horses, but with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the ships soon evolved into steam-driven, with the first of its kind making this journey on the 10th of August 1813, and it would run without any real problems for just under 4 years, sailing from the nearby Foundry Bridge on the River Wensum, as Wright's Norwich and Yarmouth Steam Packet, who operated two ships, one named the Telegraph and the second Nelson. Packets were medium-sized ships, used largely in inland rivers across Europe and North America at the time. The date was Friday, the 4th of April, 1817. But it was not just any Friday. The 4th marked Good Friday that year, so many of the passengers that day were going to spend their Easter weekends by the coast, while others were returning home to Yarmouth, Acle and North Craig. It also just happened to be the 6th anniversary of the completion of the nearby Foundry Bridge, a construction that had already brought a loss of life to this part of the river, when a 10-year-old boy who was working on it fell into the river and, unable to swim, drowned. There was seemingly nothing that suggested this journey was going to be any different from the one made many times before over the years. The 22 passengers boarded, the fires were stoked, and soon steam was rising from the funnel. Departure time came round, the gangplanks were taken away, and the ropes holding her to the dock were cast off. All on board settled down for the 27-mile journey through the Norfolk Broads. Elsewhere in the city, residents were going about their daily activities when they were suddenly snapped out of their regular routines as a heavy explosion rocked the city. The steamboat had only moved about 20 yards from their start position, when it suddenly, and what must have seemed to everyone involved or nearby, randomly exploded, throwing debris and passengers high into the air, killing 9 instantly and injuring many others. The area along what is now called Riverside was total carnage, strewn with wreckage. The river is said to be running red with the blood of the passengers. Passers-by rushed to the river, first to see what was happening and then to try and help, dragging wounded from the water, many suffering from burns, broken arms and broken legs. Others had lost limbs completely. Those who could be saved were taken to the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital as quickly as possible, but even with medical treatment, one more still died that night while receiving care. Others taken there were suffering from life-changing injuries. Esther Walton, aged 50, from Great Yarmouth, had badly fractured one of her legs, which had to be amputated. Mary Stephen, also from Yarmouth and aged 36, wound up losing both her legs to the surgeon's knife due to compound fractures. Miraculously, 7 had escaped, either unhurt or with only minor injuries. Even some who had bad luck of being directly over the boiler when it blew had somehow survived, including the vessel's engineer, a steward, and 3 young children, including an infant. There was little left of the vessel itself. The force of the explosion had obliterated almost everything. The vessel was rent to atoms, so that little remains entire, from the stern to the engine room, except the keel and the flooring. The explosion was reported in the Norwich Mercury. 22 passengers appear to have been on board. The bodies of 8 are found, 5 men and 3 women. 1 child is missing, and 6 have been sent to hospital in a wounded state. 6 escaped unhurt. 1 person later died in hospital of their injuries. This was followed by the remarkable escape of several of those on board. One man was standing over the boiler when the explosion happened. It is said Major Mason was another, whose clothes were torn off by the shock, but was otherwise uninjured. The third was an infant, 2 months old, and the little innocent was discovered at the bottom of the vessel in a profound sleep, after the removal of the dreadful wreck. By the end of the day, the list of those killed in the explosion stood as William Battledore, William Richardson, or possibly Nickerson, who was at the helm of the vessel when it blew, John Maron, Richard Squire, Thomas Louis, Elizabeth Stevens, Diana Smith, Mary Bleasey, and her 4-year-old son, John Bleasey. The city was shaken by the tragedy, and soon an investigation began to discover what had caused it. And a public fund was set up to raise money for those hurt and the family of those killed, that raised £350, £30,756.27 today. Despite what had happened, there was still a need for a quicker way to Norwich and Great Yarmouth, and it should come as no real shock. With the general attitude of just moving on that was common at the time, the vessel was soon replaced. First with a non-powered boat that was pulled along the river by 4 horses, and after some time, new and improved steam-powered vessels that made the journey daily. As the investigation gave pace, as always, the media did some of its own digging and soon found a rather juicy tidbit to release, that in a country only really just emerging from the long and bitterly fought Napoleonic Wars must have come as some controversy. John Wright, the owner of the doomed vessel, had bought the main structure of the boat from France and subsequently added the steam boiler to it. And no doubt there would have been some talk that had it been a British-built boat, this probably wouldn't have happened. There were also rumours that Wright was taking part in some kind of bet on how fast his boat could reach Great Yarmouth, and had had the steam escape valve strapped down to help increase speed that would lead to the explosion. Others have claimed the race was set up by the crew of the Telegraph and the crew of the Nelson to see who was faster on that day. But the truth that was found by the investigation, the cause seems to be a mix of things. The first coming from the boiler itself and how it was built. Possibly to save money, rather than being made purely from cast iron as was generally required. Instead, other metals had been mixed in, making it far weaker and greatly increasing the risk of an explosion. This is bad enough, but there was a good deal of blame to lay on John Wright. Despite the money he had been taking in over the years for these journeys, little was being put back to keeping the boats up to scratch. Among the things he had neglected was the maintenance of the safety valve, meant to release steam if pressure got too much for the boiler to handle, leading it to not opening properly when it was meant to. Either of these problems alone had the possibility of putting lives in danger, but put together they were a recipe for disaster. The inquiry returned a verdict of accidental death, but ordered John Wright to pay compensation to the victims and their families. I've been unable to discover exactly how much he was made to pay back, but it was enough, mixed with a now unsalvageable reputation, to end his business and leave him destitute. The incident set off a chain of events that would lead to a huge improvement of safety standards when it came to vessels of this nature, after it was brought up in Parliament on the 8th of May 1817 by a Mr. Harvey. The House must have all heard of the unfortunate accident which happened some time ago at Norwich, when so many persons lost their lives in consequence of the explosion of the boiler of a steam packet. The cause of that explosion was owing to the boiler not being of a right construction. It was from its being made of cast iron, and not of cast iron only, but a cast iron mixed with other metals, which greatly increased the danger. And one built in this fashion was hardly an uncommon thing at the time. There were many boats of this type scattered all across the country, any one of them now a potential bomb waiting to go off under the feet of unsuspecting passengers. Mr. Harvey knew this and put forward something had to be done, following on his statement of what had happened at Norwich with, that a committee be appointed to consider of the means of preventing mischief or explosion from happening on board steamboats, to the danger or destruction of His Majesty's subjects on board such boats. The use of all steam packets were halted by order of the government until full safety checks could be carried out, and a greater push for improvement of designs was undertaken, as was the correct training for the men who were to be crewing them. Much as it was in Norwich, initially they were replaced with old horse-drawn versions, or sailing versions, before these updated and much safer steam vessels were able to put into the water. The explosion of the Telegraph seems to be largely unknown and untalked about in the city today. There is no marker to what happened on that part of the river, nor anything that I have ever seen. And, as mentioned before, I had not even heard of it until while on holiday last week, while reading a magazine I picked up on the Norfolk Broads. There is a pub called the Steam Packet on Crown Road, but I believe this is more named after the type of ships in general, rather than the incident itself. The explosion, however, does act as a backdrop of a new murder mystery novel by local author Chris Crowther, called Watershed. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All of the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. This was the Norwich steamboat explosion of 1817, and this was a little bit of history.